For 9 seasons, Michael Landon played one of the most beloved fathers in television history, Charles Ingalls of Little House on the Prairie. As Charles, he worked himself ragged for his family. He forgave his enemies, reared his daughters with patience, stood up to corrupt men, and never once chose himself over the people who depended on him. Generations of viewers grew up thinking that he was a stand-up guy, and I was one of those viewers. Netflix premieres a new version of Little House on the Prairie on July the 9th, and frankly, I'm a little scared. Nervous this show won't be anywhere near as good as the version I remember as a little girl in the 1980s. The show was darn near perfection to me, but I'm going to wait and see what happens with this new one. Are you looking forward to it? Let me know in the comments. Original cast members Allison Arngrim, who played Nellie Olson, and Dean Butler, who played Almanzo Wilder, told Remind magazine that this new series focuses more closely on Laura Ingalls Wilder's actual books than the NBC series did. They also pushed back against viewers demanding the reboot avoid quote-unquote woke content, pointing out that the original series already tackled racism, addiction, nativism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, rape, and spousal abuse. Even Melissa Gilbert, who played Laura for the entire original run, said she had no issue with the new adaptation and that there was plenty of room for someone else's interpretation. So the question worth asking before the series airs is simple. Will this version finally show audiences who Charles Ingalls really was? Who all of the Ingalls really were? Or will Netflix repeat the same decision that Michael Landon made 50 years ago, handing viewers another comfortable myth instead of the man underneath it? Because the real Charles Ingalls was nothing like the character generations fell in love with. And that's what I'm going to get into with you today, the real Charles Ingalls and his family. The truth is, if Michael Landon hadn't made the decision to massively overhaul their image, their story would have been way too dark for family primetime viewing. Now, I think that we already know it's impossible to get a Charles Ingalls on screen who was as handsome and as charismatic as Michael Landon, but I guess that's neither here nor there. At least for now, my plan is to recap and review the show here with you, and I asked if you all were interested in discussing the Little House reboot, and at the time of my recording this video, 56% of you said yes to that. So if some more video content and live streams on this version of Little House on the Prairie is of interest to you, please subscribe. And if the show holds our interest, we'll stick with it. And we also have the Gilded Age coming up, plus I cover scandalous history in general. And if you like that, make yourself at home here. Now, on to why you are here, the dark truth about the Ingalls. The story started in Kansas, on land legally still belonging to the Native Americans of the Osage Nation. Charles Ingalls never filed a homestead claim there. He couldn't because the land wasn't yet open for settlement, but he moved his family onto it anyway, based on nothing more than a rumor that the government planned to force the Osage out eventually. Laura put the truth directly in her father's mouth decades later. In the book, Pa said that if some politicians in Washington had not sent word that it would be all right to settle there, he never would have crossed 3 miles over the line into Indian territory. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was gambling that Washington would do the dirty work of removal for him. And that's bad enough, but it got worse. The cabin itself, the little house that gave the entire series its name, was built from logs that belonged to the Osage. Laura Ingalls Wilder biographer Caroline Fraser called it what it was, straight-up theft. Nobody in 1869 called it that. Charles Ingalls certainly did not see himself as a thief, but the building materials in his own hands were never his to take. And privately, he was not the tolerant and downright loving man that the television show wanted you to admire and remember. He told young Laura that he expected different tribes to go to war with each other, killing each other off and clearing his path to the land without him having to lift a finger. This was not a man caught in a moral gray area. This was a man hoping that violence would do his work for him. And Carolyn Ingalls was not a passive bystander to her husband's land grab. The book has her openly prejudiced against the Osage, calling them devils and telling young Laura flatly that she just didn't like them. When Laura asked her mother the obvious question, why move to Indian country at all if she hated Indians, Carolyn had no real answer. At one point, Pa himself almost called the Osage devils before Carolyn cut him off, not because she disagreed, but because she did not want to frighten the children. This was the household atmosphere of the real Laura Ingalls, not Michael Landon's fictional, tolerant, and loving Ma Ingalls. Instead, Ma was a woman who resented and hated the people whose land her family was occupying and never pretended otherwise. Television Charles Ingalls was steady. He picked a town, built a home, and stayed. The real Charles Ingalls could not sit still for more than a few years at a time. He dragged his family from Wisconsin to Kansas, from Kansas back to Wisconsin, from Wisconsin to Minnesota, from Minnesota then to Iowa, from Iowa back to Minnesota again, and from Minnesota finally to the Dakota Territory. Charles himself was quoted using a phrase that became one of the most repeated lines associated with him. His wandering foot got to itching. It was not adventure, it was instability, dressed up later as a personality trait. Minnesota nearly finished the family off entirely. A grasshopper plague rolled through for 4 straight years, from 1873 to 1877, destroying 2 consecutive harvests and the farm along with them. In the chaos of fleeing toward Iowa, hoping for a fresh start, 9-month-old Charles Frederick Ingalls died suddenly. Audiences who grew up watching the show rarely even knew this child existed. Iowa offered no relief. A hotel partnership pulled the family there, and it collapsed before it even got off the ground. Charles moved the family into the Masters Hotel itself to run it, with Carolyn cooking for guests and Mary and Laura serving tables. All 5 Ingalls crammed into one small room near the kitchen. The hotel sat right next to a saloon, and Charles tried his hand at a grist mill for a few months, while the girls grew up exposed to the drinking and rough crowd next door. Eventually, he moved them out of the hotel entirely into rented rooms above a grocery store nearby, hoping to put some distance between his daughters and the saloon. Carolyn Ingalls was rewritten just as thoroughly as her husband in the opposite direction. The show made her gentle and soft-spoken, played by Karen Grassley as calm and even-tempered. The real Carolyn did the same back-breaking physical labor her husband did, without complaint, with the show only rarely depicting it. She put both Mary and Laura to work alongside her in the Masters Hotel in Burr Oak, making beds, washing dishes, and waiting tables, a side of frontier motherhood the gentle, domestic TV Ma Ingalls didn't really show. She also was not standing passively behind her husband's decisions the way the show's Carolyn often did. Research into Pioneer Girl shows it was the real Carolyn who finally put a stop to Charles's wandering after he wanted to chase a stranger's secondhand tip that bees did better out in Oregon. Side note here. Pioneer Girl is Laura Ingalls Wilder's original adult memoir, the unpublished manuscript she wrote before the Little House children's books existed. It's where she first put her actual life story on paper, written for an adult audience rather than children, before publishers rejected it and she reworked the material into the fictionalized, sanitized series everyone knows. Now, back to the family. This is the detail that should end any conversation about Charles and Carolyn being a stand-up pioneer couple. In Pioneer Girl, Laura described something her parents did together that never made it into any version of the children's series. The bills had piled up. Doctor's bills, grocery bills, rent. Charles asked their landlord, a man named Bisbee, for an extension. Bisbee refused and threatened to seize the family's horses, the only thing standing between the Ingalls and total financial ruin. So Charles and Carolyn together loaded the wagon under the cover of darkness, woke their children in the middle of the night, and snuck the entire family out of town to avoid paying what they owed. By the time the Ingalls reached Burr Oak, Iowa, the money was gone. They were poor enough that the whole town could see it, and poor enough that a well-off neighbor decided to do something about it. Eunice Starr, the wife of a local doctor, came to Carolyn with an offer. She wanted to adopt Laura, then 9 years old, and raise the girl as her own. The offer was not made out of pity for the child. It was made to take the daughter off the hands of parents who plainly could not provide for the children they already had. Carolyn said no. By Laura's own account, her mother answered that she could not spare her. Not that she loved her too much to let her go. The word spare did real work in that sentence. In these same years, the Ingalls were hiring Laura out to other households, sending her to cook, to clean, and to mind other people's children for wages, while she was still a child herself. Whatever she earned went home to the family. So a daughter the Ingalls could not afford to feed was also a daughter who brought money in. Handing Laura to the doctor and his wife would have closed one mouth at the supper table for sure, but also cut off a source of the very income the family was scrambling to find. She was not only a burden someone offered to ease, she was a legitimate earner the Ingalls could not afford to lose, as her mother said, could not afford to spare. This was the same family who, once they finally reached Dakota Territory, chasing a railroad job, promised each other that this would be the last move. That promise had already been broken more times than anyone in the household could count. The pattern did not stop once they settled in De Smet, South Dakota. Charles opened a general goods store in 1880. He had to close it within the year. This was not a family undone by one piece of catastrophic bad luck. This was a recurring inability to build anything that lasted, stretching across 2 decades and 4 different states. Some biographers are gentler about all of this than the facts probably deserve, framing Charles as a dreamer crushed by repeated disaster rather than a man responsible for his own failures. Others call him exactly what the record shows, a man who consistently could not provide stability for the people depending on him, no matter how many fresh starts he was given. Either way, the contrast with the television character could not be sharper. Michael Landon's Pa Ingalls never skipped out on a debt, never gambled his family's safety on a rumor about land that was never his, and certainly would have never considered giving up his precious little half-pint or any of his daughters. Mary's blindness was one of the show's most emotional storylines. The real Mary Ingalls lost her sight in 1879 at 14 years old. Scarlet fever took it, audiences were told, and that explanation has repeated for decades as settled fact. It almost certainly isn't what happened. A team of researchers led by a University of Michigan pediatrician spent more than a decade on the question and concluded that the real culprit was far more likely viral meningoencephalitis. They had good reason. A register from Mary's school, the Iowa College for the Blind, listed the cause for her blindness as brain fever, the period term for exactly that kind of brain inflammation. A newspaper back when she first fell ill reported that she had been struck down by a sudden severe sickness, and that one side of her face had become partially paralyzed. Even Laura was never sure. In a 1937 letter to her daughter, she first wrote that Mary had spinal meningitis, then crossed it out and called it some sort of spinal sickness, admitting she did not think the doctor ever named it. The show took a real medical mystery the family itself could not explain and flattened it into one tidy, familiar disease. And because you tell me that you like seeing the newspapers from the periods that I cover, I wanted to show you this. It's something from a local newspaper about the Ingalls family, and it shows that the same way that TV audiences were hooked on Mary's story and hoping that she would somehow miraculously pull through and not go fully blind, so were the townspeople. From the Redwood Gazette on June 12, 1879. Miss Mary Ingalls is recovering, but slowly. Her eyesight, which she had almost lost, is improving as she gains strength. End quote. Well, we know that in the end, her eyesight did not improve. And here, 10 years later, in the August 21st, 1889 edition of the Sioux City Journal, you can see that Mary is listed among the graduates of the Home for the Blind. And just a little strange coincidence, if you look 2 lines below Mary's name, there are 2 Olsons who graduated too. Even though the Olsons were a fictional name Michael Landon created for the show, there's their last name. But I'll get into more of that into the next video. There's something more to that connection, and it's really interesting. I'll talk about it in my next Little House on the Prairie video. And then there was Carrie Ingalls. Remember her? It wouldn't be a surprise if you don't. She got almost no real story on screen, and the real woman who Carrie grew into deserved a real story on TV. Carrie was played by the Greenbush twins from the start and stayed a child through most of the run, reading as a young teenager maybe by the time that the show ended in 1983. The series followed Laura into adulthood, but it never did the same for Carrie, so her grown-up life never made it on screen. But it was pretty fascinating for a woman of her times. The real Carrie went to work as a typesetter at the De Smet newspaper at the age of 19 and learned the whole printing trade, then was recruited by E.L. Senn, the man who they called the final proof king of South Dakota, who sent her out to run his papers in the mining towns of the Black Hills. Here's a brief about her from a 1910 edition of the Rapid City Journal that shows that she was a newspaper editor of the Hill City Star. Honestly, from the 1880s on, Carrie's name was always in the newspapers, mainly because she lived in small towns that had slow news days and seemed to write about everyone and everything in town. But regardless of that, her life was extraordinarily well-rounded for a single woman at the turn of the century. Around 1907, she filed a homestead claim of her own and lived alone in a tar paper shanty out near the edge of the Badlands, 6 months a year as the law required, decades before anyone would have called that ordinary for a single woman. She lived the adventurous, independent life the show handed to no Ingalls daughter at all. And on a somewhat spicier note, even the romance at the center of Laura's own adult life got a quiet revision. By the time Laura married Almanzo Wilder in 1885, she was 18 and he was 28, a 10-year gap that Frontier Dakota would have found unremarkable. Their courtship had run a little more than 2 years, beginning when she was still a teenager, teaching school, and Almanzo drove her home through the Dakota winters. None of this scandalized her town. A man 10 years older courting a 16-year-old who already held a teaching certificate was ordinary for the time and place. What changed was the telling. Writing decades later for an audience of children, Laura appears to have adjusted the ages and the timeline on the page, smoothing the parts that a 20th century reader would sit with less easily than her real-life neighbors ever did. Some scholars believe that Laura understood that the age gap between Almanzo and a teenage Laura would disturb modern readers in a way that it didn't disturb those who actually lived it, a generation that was used to sending girls from middle school straight into womanhood. It's so crazy to think about today, but knowing then that it, just wasn't uncommon for, let's say, a 14-year-old to get married and start a family. That's just the way that it was. But anyway, the age games with Almanzo didn't start with his courtship of Laura. They started with the land. When Almanzo came to Dakota Territory in 1879 to file his homestead claim, the law required him to be 21. By Laura's own account, in the long winter, he was only 19, and he kept it quiet, because a man that age had no legal right to claim the 160 acres he was standing on. The detail is easy to skip past in a children's book, but it describes a young man bending the rules of the Homestead Act to take public land before he was allowed to. What makes it stranger is that the record never fully settled his age at all. His own homestead papers list him as 26. The census taken the year after he filed calls him 22, and Almanzo himself spent the rest of his life giving a birth year that none of those documents support. The man at the center of Laura's great love story carried at least 2 different ages for most of his life, and even now, no one can say for certain which one, if either, or any of them, were real. But the story Laura told us was the same story twice. The 2 most important men in her life, her father and her husband, both took land that they had no legal right to claim, and she recorded it herself, even as the TV show scrubbed it away. And some of the people audiences loved the best were never real at all. The Ingalls family on screen took in and raised 3 children, Albert, James Cooper, and Cassandra Cooper, none of whom existed in the books or in the real household. Michael Landon invented them outright, folding adopted children into the Ingalls family once the source material began to run thin. The real Charles and Carolyn Ingalls, too poor through the 1870s to feed their own daughters, certainly never adopted any additional children. The household that opened its doors to orphans was indeed a television creation. Also, their religious faith followed the same pattern. The TV show built the Ingalls into one of the most openly Christian families on television, praying through every crisis, quoting scripture at the supper table, gathering in church each Sunday as a defining rhythm of their lives. Well, that devotion belonged to Michael Landon far more than to the people he was portraying. Historian John Fry, who spent an entire book examining Laura Ingalls Wilder's religious life, concluded that while Christianity mattered to her, it was never a central part of her life. She rarely held church membership, seldom wrote about her beliefs, and kept her faith private for most of her life. Religion sat lightly in the real story of the Ingalls, as opposed to how on screen Michael Landon made it the story of the family. So here's where that leaves Netflix's new version premiering on July the 9th. The cast members defending this reboot are right that the original series was never as innocent as nostalgia remembers it, but being willing to discuss racism and addiction on screen is not exactly the same thing as being willing to show audiences a father who skipped town on his debts in the dead of the night, and a mother who was profoundly ignorant about the very people whose land her family had stolen, and a household who was so visibly poor that a neighbor offered to take one of their children off their hands. Michael Landon built America's favorite television family by quietly removing almost everything that made the real Ingalls difficult to love. Whether this new adaptation has the nerve to put any of it back remains to be seen. Based on history's track record with this family, I'd say let's not get our hopes up. But nevertheless, I'll be watching and ready to talk about it with you. Until then, if you want to get into my content on another TV series period piece, check out my playlist on The Gilded Age. There's plenty to see about the real-life stories that were covered in the first 3 seasons, and I'll add more after we have our premiere date for Season 4. Thank you for letting me be a part of your day. My sources for this story are on the screen.